So I welcome everybody to this evening lecture. And the lecture tonight is a keynote on a conference that has taken place during the last 3 days on the topic of Michael Tomasello's Evolutionary Anthropology and Religion. Now, Michael Tomasello has not yet published extensively on the topic of religion. And therefore, we chose the undertitle of our conference, which is Exploring the Philosophical and Theological Relevance of Evolutionary Anthropology. You can only explore what is not already evident and well known. So the conference has a somewhat anticipatory angle, exploring the various facets of the topic that we invite Michael Tomasello to consider if he decided to enlarge on this topic, possibly in the way of a book on the, for example, the natural history of religion, as Wesley Wildman yesterday already suggested. And of course, we organizers and participants in this conference severely encourage him to do that. Now, let me come to our speaker tonight, Marcia. She is a professor of multilingual and multicultural studies at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education and Human Development of New York University. And she is a regular guest professor at the Theological faculty of Humboldt University in Berlin. She has been rewarded the Mercator Guest Professorship of the German Research Foundation, has been repeatedly fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, which is the most prestigious institute for advanced study in Germany, and last year at the renowned Princeton-based Center for Theological Inquiry. She is also a permanent fellow of the New York Institute for the Humanities. Her research focuses on religion, culture, and politics as it is reflected in various of her books. In Die hintergründige Religion, der Einfluss des Evangelikalismus auf Gewissensfreiheit, Pluralismus und die US-amerikanische Politik from 2008, and in The New Evangelicals, Expanding the Vision of the Common Good, 2 books, Marcia corrects the widespread European or at least German bias that evangelicalism is an exclusively ultra-conservative religious movement that is skeptical of liberal democracy by pointing to the vibrant progressive wings of evangelicalism as well as its history as a formative power of liberal American democracy. In Warnung vor dem Freunde, Tradition und Zukunft US-amerikanischer Außenpolitik, she shows the historically strong influence that evangelicalism has had on American politics, particularly on foreign politics. In her book, Commonwealth and Covenant, Economics, Politics, and the Theologies of Relationality from about 5 years ago, Marcia applied intellectual history, philosophy, and the theologies of relationality to develop a framework for economic and political policy. According to Marcia, we are unique individuals, yet we become our singular selves only through networks of relations and responsibilities to the people and environments around us. And I think her talk tonight will also be a little bit on this topic. Both separability and situatedness, relationness, have to be included together in worldview and policy. The book investigates which economic and political policies would actually follow from the acknowledgement of the ontology of separability amid situatedness. Lob der Kritik, warum die Demokratie nicht auf ihren Kern verzichten darf, is a book with a rather self-explanatory title. And I mention it here particularly to point out that Marcia has not just theoretically reflected on the importance of critical voices for democracy, but that she always was one of them. Much earlier than her academic career, she started as an engaged journalist, and as a public intellectual, she has contributed to a vast amount of articles to what has Rang und Namen among US as well as German periodicals. Her essays have been published from Village Voice to Penthouse, from the German Taz to the FAZ, from New York Times to Die Zeit, just to give you an idea of the range and spectrum within which she has made her voice audible. As someone living in New York and in Berlin, and in between, she surely is a cosmopolitan intellectual, and nothing reflects this in a more entertaining and stylistically splendid way than her Liebeserklärungen aus Kreuzberg and Manhattan, wonderful, literally inspired journalistic vignettes about two geographical centers of her life. More recently, she has done research on evolutionary biology and psychology centering around an evolutionary account of human aggression. Since we have shared a lot of thoughts during the last days on the origins of cooperativeness and morality, it seems to be time for the dark side of our origins. Just how aggressive are we? Marcia, we are keen to hear your answer to this question. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And I will say briefly, how aggressive are we is actually much less than we think. But we will begin to get into some ideas about that. I'm going to share my screen to bring up a PowerPoint presentation. Can you see this? Are we good? Great. Okay. As I understand it, one of the purposes of our conference is to discuss, in the words of our wonderful conference organizers, whether it is possible to formulate a non-reductive understanding of the evolution of religion. Now, this might mean that we're looking for, one, whether religion plays a role in human evolution, or two, what evolution science can tell us about how religion evolved. I confess I know little about the first topic. In the longer printed version of this paper, however, I will say a few remarks about the religious question about the nature of humanity, just how violent are we, and under what conditions does systemic human-on-human violence emerge? And the second topic, what evolutionary biology can tell us about how religion developed. These two parts, the nature of humanity and what evolution tells us about religion, are about equal in length, which would make my presentation, if I went into both of them, about twice as long as determined for this keynote. So rather than interfere with your dinner plans, I'll limit my remarks to the second topic, what evolution tells us about the emergence of religion. Can you see the next slide? Great. About 8,000 BCE, with the development of sedentarism, agriculture, and therefore of surpluses ever ready to be taken by force, both within the group and between groups, we find the emergence of severe systemic violence between and within groups, which remains with us today. But prior to that, for 95% of human development, Homo sapiens were, as Michael Tomasello writes, a hyper-cooperative species. He proposes not only that Homo sapiens are hyper-cooperative in contrast to systemically aggressive, as in later agricultural societies, but that our very cognitive and socio-emotional capacities, what makes us human rather than chimp, emerges from our cooperative interactivity. I'm going to suggest that this interactivity that is at the core of so much of Tomasello's work may tell us something also about the development of ritual and religion. Human cognitive development begins, as Tomasello explains, with the playful copying and exchange of gestures and facial expressions between human infants with long dependent childhoods and their kin and non-kin caretakers. This exchange requires both high and prolonged levels of interactivity and the cooperative community social conditions that make such prolonged interactivity possible. The playful give and take, Sean Gallagher notes, brings the infant into a direct relation with another person and starts them on the course of social interaction, close quote. We do not develop alone, but within, quote, the larger system of body environment intersubjectivity, end quote. This back and forth exchange yields a we-centric or unified common intersubjective space, Vittorio Gallese writes, with a wide variety of others that even infants know are different from themselves. To mimic, be mimicked, and to play around is to participate in the world of different others, not an undifferentiated we space, but an I-you space, as Vasudevi Reddy notes. Reddy continues, being imitated seems to establish a powerful and immediate statement of interest, connection, and intentional relation. It is being imitated which is crucial for intimacy. In short, Reddy explains, you have to be addressed as a subject to become one. Human cognitive and emotional growth is grounded in this interaction to arrive at what Sarah Hrdy calls the emotional modernity of the last 250,000 or so years. What is this emotional modernity? The capacities to grasp and coordinate with the attention of others, the intention of others, and the emotions of others in order to sustain relationships through which one feels safe and learns about the world. Importantly, learning and relating generalized to strangers, a capacity that became critical for intergroup interaction as well as communal childcare, as Hrdy, Kristen Hawkes, and again Tomasello note. However advantageous communal childcare was in hunter-gatherer societies for increasing fecundity, it also required each child to attract the attention of busy kin and non-kin caretakers. Through what? Through social interaction. Tomasello's work on cognitive development elaborates on this human interaction and explains its step-by-step development into human cognition. He notes that joint attention and intention created the basis for role reversal and recursive thinking. Role reversal entails the understanding, for instance, that if I touch your arm, you touch not your arm, but my arm. It's the touching of the arm of the other that is the task, regardless of who is doing the touching. This allows tasks to be separated from actor and distributed to various persons. Additionally, role exchange, psychologist Lev Vygotsky noted in the 1930s, allows children to internally assume the role of the caretaker and so to self-regulate towards what they know by age 3 is not just a caretaker's idiosyncratic behavior, but normative group practice. From role reversal, we'll move to Tomasello's recursive thinking, which involves my understanding that you want me to know, that you know, that I know, that you know, etc. Together, role reversal and recursive thinking allow for complex collaborative endeavors, not only joint intention, but interdependent intention, where actions may be assigned to various persons, each knows the other's roles, and importantly trusts that the other person will do it fairly so that all benefit. The benefit is not me, you, but collective. Here we have the foundations of specifically human cognition and interdependent intention, planning, and execution of group activities, a group-mindedness and identity, where each has a sense of obligation to act fairly according to group norms, for the group. Fairness violations upset even group members who are not harmed by them because they harm the group. Fairness violators know that they are justly criticized and will lose their identity as part of the group if they persist in violations. Even before Homo sapiens, Robert Bellah notes, the Homo erectus evolved, quote, an entirely new level of social organization beyond anything seen in non-human primates. Playful copying exchange bridges otherness. As our, quote, deep enculturation, Merlin Donald writes, it emerges from and reinforces our hyper-cooperativity. It isn't just, Alison Gopnik concludes, that without mothering, humans would lack nurturance, warmth, and emotional security. They would also lack culture, history, morality, science, and literature. We would also lack ritual that commemorates belief of a shared world. That is the beginnings of religion. And it is to this link between ritual, religion, and human cognitive and emotional development that we now turn. The basic socio-cognitive abilities just described foster an additional capacity, the abstraction of sequences of behavior, not only from actor, but from immediate context. Whatever the action, it can be done today, tomorrow, or again next year. It can be done here, there, or in a place collectively remembered, but not present in view. This enables humans to learn and communicate tasks not only for present, but also for future application, and to symbolically, in gesture and language, reenact not only past tasks, but past events, to tell stories, to communicate future collaborative plans, and to describe a hypothetical scene. That is not only how one used this tool, but how one could use it in a situation that has not yet occurred. Among humans, it is not only memories that can be recounted, but imagined worlds. We coordinate with the attention, intention, and emotions of others, not only about present happenings, but about past, and not only about the past, but about the conjectured and the imagined. Taken together, the imagining of the conjectured and the fictional by a species capable of collaboration, repeatable activities, with shared attention and agreed upon intentions, may be the origin not only of survival projects like food procurement, but of play, games, theater, and art. Repeatable, complex collaboration about the unseen, about an imagined world, is present in all play activities. And from play, repeatable, intentional activities that reference the past, future, and imagined may come ritual. Also, an intentional activity that repeats action patterns and references the past, the future, and the believed. I am here not attempting an exhaustive definition of religion, but rather to note that religion, not private individual faith of some sort, but group phenomenon, involves at least ritual that references the past, the future, and the believed. Johann Huizinga, in his classic study of play, wrote, "In myth and ritual, the great instinctive forces of civilized life have their origin. Law and order, commerce and profit, craft and art, poetry, wisdom and science, all are rooted in the primeval soil of play." Michael Tomasello, nearly 70 years later, echoes, "Cognitively, the dual-level structure of simultaneous sharedness, creating socially shared realities, and individuality, the individual's perspective within those shared realities, characterizes everything from children's pretend play to adults' cultural institutions. Shared worlds, real and imagined, in a species of collaborative attention, intention, and emotion, allow from communal collaborative activities from sports to worship services. While these cognitive capacities help explain why play, theater, and ritual are humanly possible, they do not yet explain function. What benefit does play or ritual provide? I'll look at two, beginning with bonding and belonging. We have seen that playful exchange among persons promotes a we-centric or unified common intersubjective space through which we align ourselves with the attention, intention, and emotions of others in order to sustain relationships, feel safe, and learn about the world. As this exchange develops into collaborative play and ritual, these secondary activities too carry with them the sense of bonding, safety, and belonging. Play and ritual are heirs, so to speak, of the sense of bonding and belonging of earlier Homo sapien playful exchange. The activity of performing together shared ritual patterns gives humans the sense of relatedness and belonging needed for our long-evolved social nature. This may include music, movement, sequenced gestures, recitation, and much more. As we know, children who lack such social interaction and collaborative play suffer from cognitive and emotional impairment. Adults who become isolated suffer from increased risk of suicide, mortality, and morbidity, including depression and other emotional disorders, and now the well-known phrase from Case and Deaton, deaths of despair. Here we have what I hope is a visual sketch of what I've been suggesting. Humanity's social nature leads to copying and exchange of gestures, spatial expression, and acculturation into group activities, reinforcing bonding and belonging, which becomes performing together shared play and ritual, which in turn reinforces bonding and belonging again, and refers back to humanity's social nature. Indeed, Claire et al. Describe the Göbekli Tepe hunter-gatherer ritual site as just such a bond-building arena. Quote, Göbekli Tepe could be understood as the stage and scenery for a late hunter-gatherer mythological narrative, one used by these communities for the conveyance of shared moral values, the documentation of group memories and histories, the formation of identities, and the promotion of intergroup cooperation and altruism. Göbekli Tepe is a ritual site that is not within the city of one particular group. Indeed, it's a hunter-gatherer site where many groups visited in repeating ritual patterns and built intergroup cooperation and altruism, as well as enforcing their own intra-group shared world. In addition to bolstering altruism among groups, belonging, and common values, play and ritual serve a second function. They play act what troubles us. From horsing around, which is playing at fighting, to fairy tales, roller coasters, and theater, play allows us to near and experience, or nearly experience, fears, tensions, and greatest hopes in the relative safe environment of the game, so as to better broker those fears and hopes in our emotional and psychological centers. As we confront fears and desires that threaten safety and the self, the fictive confrontation with fears tells us that we can survive because in every play event, no matter how much it skirts danger, we, the players and the audience, end alive and intact. The final, if implicit, scene of every fiction and ritual is survival. We have made it through the gauntlet, the terrifying scene, to live to tell about it and to commemorate it in ritual. Robert Sklar writes that fiction gives audiences the experience of, quote, the dangerous, the fantastic, the grotesque, the impossible, at a close but safe remove, close quote. When the game is over, when the ritual ends or the lights in the theater come up, the lesson is that no matter how many actors are dead in the game, ritual, or on stage, we prevail. We are psychologically bolstered for the risky project of living. Our first fictions, as Freud reminds us, are dreams, which theatricalize what disturbs and frightens us. But we do much of our play awake and together because of the cognitive emotional processes described above. Performing together shared ritualized patterns bolsters feelings of belonging and safety. And as this develops into play and ritual, these too make for feelings of belonging and safety needed when confronting danger and daunting hopes. This, Siegfried Kracauer holds, is what we do when we create awake dreams in theater, film, and other ritualized reenactments. We depend on them, Kracauer writes, quote, for the reflection of happenings which would petrify us were we to encounter them in real life, close quote. When a hunter-gatherer band paints or enacts a dangerous hunt, the group confronts its hopes and trepidations in the safe, controlled arena of the ritual, and courage is bolstered for the hunt itself. Play and ritual, then, are mediating forms that allow us to broker dread and daunting. The considerable insecurities of hunter-gatherer life, such as the fear of animal predation or lack of food, and the severe systemic aggression that began with early agrarian societies, are just the sort of dreads to make art and ritual about. They were dangers that the human mind mediates in dreams, play, and ritual to be able to cope better in life. One of the conference organizers remarked to me that not a word of religion, or nearly not a word, appears in Tomasello's oeuvre, as he concurred in his keynote address. And yet his life's research addresses central religious concerns, the nature of our species as hyper-cooperative, and the specific steps of human cognitive and socio-emotional development that make ritual, commemorating the beliefs of a shared world, not only possible, but what we Homo sapiens do, willy-nilly. We do so by dint of being creatures whose minds and emotions emerge from cooperative action patterns with others, and who thus need ritualized action patterns with others to feel safe and to broker life's dangers and daunting hopes. There are many rituals that may not fulfill the various definitions of religion, about which we will not speak or we will never get to dinner. The features of religion may be more extensive than ritual. So not all rituals are religions, but religions rely on ritual. Even where people are not traditionally religious, rituals of all sorts are sustained, and new ones are created by families and groups, small and large, long-standing and temporary, online and in person. Indeed, rituals form quite quickly. I suggest that this is the case because of the social nature of human cognition and emotion. So one might say in conclusion that this unavoidable building block of religion, ritual, runs throughout Tomasello's work at every turn. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marcia, for the really striking paper that started an intensive process of reflection on my missing pieces in theological and philosophical anthropology. So I know it is like a common phrase to say that I learned a lot, but in this case, I really learned a lot from your paper. So let me thank you at the beginning for that. And a bit unfortunate is for me and the response that you left out in your presentation, a part at the beginning concerning theodicy and maybe the theological breakpoint. So, and my response would like to address major theological aspects. So I'm allowing myself to put in the chat a reconstruction of what I would call like a modified theodicy argument that I found pretty interesting, and I would like to base my remarks on. So as I understood your argumentation, one could say that you could have like a modified argument for free will theodicies, which I find pretty interesting. You could say A, that free will theodicy need to defend creation precisely as it is, because otherwise God would not be acquitted from creating the world precisely as it is. Regarding the history of human violence, free will theodicies are confronted with the objection that doing evil is an equally natural behavior for humans as doing good is. C, evolutionary anthropology in the perspective of Tomasello shows us that human nature tends to systemic cooperation and not to systemic aggression. And I confess that I underestimated the role of how you would conceptualize the systemic cooperation within the framework of ritual. So I would emphasize that more in my response. And D, free will theodicies are capable of defending the creation precisely as it is, since its original status can be understood as both free will granting and at the same time doing good disposing. And I think that's pretty interesting. And obviously there would be need for some additional thesis regarding free will and the preconditions of it, but the structure seems to be clear in the given form. To me, this is a convincing enforcement for theodicy regarding the obligations of theoretical reason. However, mostly existential philosophers such as Albert Camus, in his recently quite successful novel, The Plague, have pointed out that it is not so much the problem of intelligibility that keeps them from accepting certain theodicies, but the practical compulsion to reject the idea of God as benevolent creator, facing only one single innocent victim within history. And I'm wondering, and I'm interested in your thoughts about it, if it is possible to argue that the insights of evolutionary anthropology, from your perspectives, are not only supporting free will theodicies, but even more than that, are within the framework of practical reasons, sustaining the identification of the question for meaning of unjust suffering as one major origin of the question for God, respectively, the evolution of religion. Since the world sometimes or even often is perceived as anti-cooperative, but cooperation is experienced as very reasonable on the other hand, there seems to be an antinomic structure within the human understanding of himself in the world, and consequently within his understanding of his own actions. Consequently, religion would fundamentally understood as a project of reason, as an essentially human longing for understanding of oneself in the world, based on the experience of communication and cooperation. Systemic aggression, on the other hand, could be understood as an expression of the refusal of the rational experience of cooperation. Theologically spoken, as an expression of sin. In fact, your thoughts surely have the potential of an impact on understanding sin and its history, usually reflected in the concept of original sin. So that is one of the major points I would have to think longer about. Thank you for that. The second point is very short. It somehow connects to the afternoon talk, the first afternoon talk, and it concerns the compatibility of your ideas of evolutionary anthropology and religion with process thought. Theologically spoken, it would be interesting to work on your concept not only as an argument for theodicy, but as an argument for understanding evolution somehow as God's becoming herself, God's history itself. Obviously, theodicy is a major part of this project. However, it fundamentally changed the preconditions, since it would be free from the Platonic Augustinian obligations of keeping God clean from the world's mess, on the one hand, and one could argue that the world is less a mess than it seems on the other. So my question as a theologian is, do you have any further thoughts on not only linking evolutionary anthropology according to Tomasello to the human practice and ritual, of religions, but to theology itself. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your reply.
Well,
thank you very much, Aaron. And again, Marcia, you have the, if you want to, you can reply directly.
thank you. And thank you for these very well thought through comments. So let me start to the first longer comment that you made about free will theodicy. So exploring these for another project that I'm working on that Stefan Steiner knows about on Leonard Cohen, I stumbled, well, I was looking at the assumption of many theodicies that aggression, human on human aggression, violence, betrayal, sin is somehow natural. And we have to explain how a perfect, benevolent God would create this as part of his creation or allow it. And that theodicies, including the free will theodicy, soul-making theodicy, cruciform theodicies, they struggle classically with this question. I was interested in the first assumption that sin and violence and aggression, especially the kind of systemic severe aggression that we see in our lives, both between groups and within our own groups, the violence that we in our own countries perpetrate on each other, the impoverishment, the imprisonment, the etc. Is this natural? And I wanted to look at this assumption that systemic violence within and between groups is natural. And when I started many years ago looking at the evolutionary biology material, I started to uncover that that there is no consensus that for the 250,000 years before agriculture, that hunter-gatherers engaged in anything like the systemic violence, not only within groups, but even between groups. The fossil evidence and much more does not lead us in that direction, but rather in the direction of hyper-cooperativity, just as Tomasello writes, and many others in the field of evolutionary biology. The capacity for aggression is likely very old, hundreds of thousands of years, necessary to deal with animal predators, for example. But the occurrence of human on human systemic violence is almost nil. And this is, I pulled together years of research in a recent article in Zygon magazine, which came up this afternoon. So my interest was in just how violent are we, that it turns out until the last 10,000 years ago, which is an evolutionary eye blink, we weren't very violent at all. And that we need, this doesn't mean that we don't have serious problems with violence, aggression, betrayal, abandonment, sin. Today, we do. But we must, I think, put it in the larger perspective that for 95% of human evolution, we didn't behave that way to each other. And that kind of systemic violence and aggression emerged under certain conditions associated with agriculture and sedentarism, and the surpluses that came about for the first time for Homo sapiens, surpluses that were available to be taken by force, both within the group and between groups. And that led to those who could take them by force, and therefore to strong men, they were almost always men, and hierarchy. And so that's the argument made in the first half of this larger paper that I didn't have time for, but I'm very glad and grateful to you for allowing a quick recap of that argument now. As for this, the last point that you made, which is really quite fascinating, the idea of God becoming in world. And this is one way of looking at God that is runs throughout certain strains of at least the Jewish and Christian traditions that I am aware of. Schelling, for example, would certainly have this view that God becomes as God self-expresses in world. Ian Barber, a contemporary theologian, but also the Kabbalist mystic Ein Sof, has the same view that God self-expresses donatively into the world and thus becomes what God is as this occurs.